Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Stovall, Dean of the Undergraduate Division in the College of Letters and Science, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of Berkeley Writers at Work. I think it's a wonderful thing when people can take off the noon hour to actually do something beyond their own specific interest and to look at the kind of writing and literature that we are producing on this campus. And I want to thank those people responsible for organizing this series, Steve Tollison, whose brainchild this has been all along, and the College Writing Program, please, and Sylvia Swift for making these afternoons possible. It is my great pleasure today to introduce our today's speaker, Georgina Kleege, who is a lecturer in the English department and who will be a guest author for Berkeley Writers at Work. Georgina Kleege has been with us at Berkeley since 2003. She has a notable career. She was actually, I didn't know this, we both taught at Ohio State at one point many years ago. She's taught at numerous universities before coming to Berkeley. She has written widely in both nonfiction and fiction. She has written works like Letters to Helen Keller, The Blind Side Unseen, and a whole series of essays, many of which have been named notable essays by the Best American Essay Series in different years. Let me just read one description of one of her works. It says, "Blind Rage is utterly absorbing, both in its grateful renditions of particular days in Keller's life and in the author's self-analysis along the way. Kleege is a gifted writer. Her description of Keller's final day is wondrous. The book has a cumulative power, and the reader, whether or not already familiar with Keller's life, will become deeply moved." So, I think we have a lot to learn from Georgina Kleege and a lot to enjoy from reading her work and especially from hearing her talk today. So without further ado, because you came to hear her and not me, let me again welcome Georgina Kleege to the Writers at Work series. Thank you, Georgina.
Thanks. Well, thanks to Dean Stovall, and thanks to the College Writing Program for creating this series and for honoring me by inviting me here today. I'm going to be reading from my book, Blind Rage, Letters to Helen Keller. And don't worry, I'm not reading all this. This is, just a few pages. Let me give you a little background about this book. First of all, to say that when I started working on a book about Helen Keller, nobody was more surprised than me, because here's the big, terrible confession. I'm somebody who grew up hating Helen Keller. I hated Helen Keller when I was a child because as a disabled child, I felt that she was held up to me as this role model it was impossible to emulate, because she was not only blind and deaf, but she went on to overcome her disabilities, to get a degree from Radcliffe, to publish books, and to be a international celebrity. And she did all that with absolute, continuous, nonstop cheerfulness. And that was the part that annoyed me. Anyway, as an adult, I, thought that maybe I had been unfair to Helen Keller and that maybe it wasn't her fault that she'd been sort of placed on this pedestal by others, and that she shouldn't be held responsible for the use others made of her biography. But when I started reading her work, and the vast majority of her writing is autobiographical, I discovered that in fact she could be blamed for the use others had made of her biography. But I guess the point is that my childish hatred and irritation kind of turned into something else. I started looking at events in Keller's life which seemed to me might challenge that perpetual cheerfulness. because my premise was that as a human being, there must have been bad days, when things went wrong, when people didn't understand her, when she felt isolated and alone, and so on and so forth. So I focused my inquiries into those events, and then sort of spin them out to figure out what it must have been like to be Helen Keller in those times and places. So what I'm going to read from today is from the first section of Blind Rage, which is about an event that took place in Keller's childhood, specifically when she was 11 years old, and she was a student at the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, which was the premier school for the blind in the world at the time. She was there with her teacher, Anne Sullivan, and she was accused of plagiarism. It's a long, complicated story, but essentially she wrote a little fairy tale called The Frost King. She wrote it as a gift for the director of the school, whose name was Mr. Michael Anagnos. And he, because she was such a celebrity, he sort of published this story in the school's annual report to show Keller's astounding progress. And in doing that, people who read that report noticed that the story bore a striking resemblance to a published story from about a generation earlier called The Frost Fairies. Anyway, because Keller was such a celebrity, this was not just, sort of something that was handled privately. Just that the Anagnos didn't say, oh, did you copy the story? You didn't understand, sort of a quiet explanation of what plagiarism means. Essentially, Keller was put on trial. There's no other way, really, to describe the event. It was in the school. It wasn't open to the public, but it was in the school. 8 teachers plus Anagnos sort of sat in judgment on her, and she was asked to explain what happened. And one of the reasons that I thought it was appropriate to read this here today, and to read from this book, and particularly to read from this section, is because it's a moment in Keller's life when I started to think about her as a writer, and the particular problems and prejudices against a writer with disabilities. So that's why I'm reading this part here today. And I'm picking this up sort of in the middle of this trial. It went on for 2 hours, okay? 11-year-old child on trial for 2 hours for plagiarism. Her teacher, Anne Sullivan, was excluded from the proceedings because there was a lot of suspicion about that she had done this, was it her, was it Helen, etc. She was eventually exonerated. The situation was explained. Basically, I won't go into all the details, but basically they figured out that the story had been read to her a couple of years before, after she had just recently acquired language, but before she was fully fluent. So it was presumed that some parts of the story stayed in her memory, and then she sat down to write a story, and this other story came to mind. Okay. So I'm going to take it up right at the point where we get into the nitty-gritty of the explanation. Now, because this book is written in an epistolary form, that is, that it's letters, the pronoun you, second person pronoun, does not refer to you, whoever you are, you in all your multiple identities. It refers to Helen Keller, okay? So to get into the spirit of this reading, I'm going to ask you to cast off your identity and to assume the identity of Helen Keller. Okay, so to do that, I would like you, this is the interactive portion of the reading, I would like you to repeat after me. I am Helen Keller.
I am Helen Keller.
Very good. Very good. And what was especially good is I could tell a lot of you were smiling when you said that. Because as you know, Helen, one of the fundamental principles of who you are is that you must always keep smiling. Okay. Okay, so this is the Perkins School in 1892. Other mentions that other names that I'm going to mention here. Anagnos, I already explained who that is. There's another teacher who's doing the questioning called Miss Lawson. There's a reference to a Mrs. Hopkins, who was a former teacher who lived in Brewster on Cape Cod, where the original reading allegedly took place. And then references to teacher, which, as you know, Helen, is the name that you always used for Anne Sullivan. I just need it. Probably like a lot of you, I'm suffering from allergies today, so don't be alarmed if I start coughing. So Helen has Helen, has just said that she knows where and when this reading of the story took place. You know that's when it happened. Miss Lawson is spelling into your hand, but you can't remember it happening? How can that be, Helen? It can be because it is, you think, but don't say. Memory is like that. You know you were there. You have been there since. When you go there, you remember being there before. You know that certain events took place there, but do you remember the events or just the telling of the events? What was the question? How can you know and not remember? What a question. It astonishes me that you don't call them on it. You know a lot of things you don't remember. You know you were born, but you don't remember that. You know when you were 18 months old, you had a fever, and when it passed, you were deaf and blind, but you don't remember that either. Is that in question now, too? How are you supposed to know how you know what you know and how you remember what you remember? You're 11 years old. You should say, "Get serious, people. Are you listening to yourselves?" But that is not how you operate. You really want to answer this question, really want to prove to them that you were acting in good faith, just a little girl trying to do something nice for the nice man who runs her school, not a ruthlessly calculating plagiarist bent on self-promotion and personal gain. Think, you tell yourself. Think, teacher tells you sometimes and taps you on the forehead. But that's not how you think of thinking. You know you have a brain in there, and the brain is the place where ideas and memories and dreams take place. But to you, it doesn't feel like the place where you know things. You know things because you touch them. You pick them up. You move your hands over and around them. You know things through your hands, the squared off patch of palm where words are spelled, the soft tips of your fingers where you feel the dots of braille. You know things as texture and vibration. You know them through your hands, your chest, the tuning fork of your ribs, the soles of your feet. You taste too, of course, and you smell things. But when you inhale scents, they go down your throat and feel like tastes. They don't rise into your brain. Miss Lawson touches your arm. "I'm thinking," you say. And then you add, "I'm trying to find the right words to explain." Then you say, "Back then, I didn't know as many words as I know now. Back then, the things I could name were things I could touch. I knew the word for water, but didn't know the word for clouds." You lift your free hand and point to the ceiling briefly, then you stop, because you don't want them to think you don't know there aren't clouds indoors. You go on. "Back then, when people read books to me," you say people because it was not just teacher. It was your mother, it was Mrs. Hopkins. You say, when people read books to me, I didn't understand every word. Sometimes I only understood every 10th word. Sometimes, even when I read to myself in Braille, I didn't understand every word. Sometimes I'd skip to the words I knew. I know how much it costs you to admit this, Helen. You feel shame at your former self's ineptitude. You wish you could claim to have known more then. You wish you had always been the superstar student you are now. I know how much it costs you because I've been there myself. When I was 11, I lost my sight, but I passed as sighted for a long time. I didn't like to say, I can't read that, or I can't see where you're pointing, because it made me sound stupid. But this is the price you have to pay. You have to expose your former self's lack of understanding. It's the whole point. Back then, you didn't know, didn't understand. You go on. Sometimes after someone read a story to me, I would ask questions, or I would ask them to tell me the story again. And I couldn't always tell if they were reading the story over to me or telling it again using different words. And sometimes someone would tell me a story, and I didn't know if it was a story from out of a book or a story that they had made up out of your free hand fingers the air, fingering it like cloth, whole cloth, thin air. Out of thin air, you say, out of imagination. Back then, I couldn't always tell which was which. Now, sometimes when I read a story, it seems familiar to me, and I think it must be because somebody read it to me back then before I fully understood. And sometimes I think it's because a lot of stories are like a lot of other stories, like the stories in Greek mythology. Again, you say this for Mr. Anagnos because you want him to remember the many conversations you've had together, how he always used to praise you and call you his special friend. But thinking this makes your lower lip tremble, so you suck it between your teeth and bite down. I think that's what happened with the frost fairies, you say. I think somebody must have read it to me that summer at Brewster. I think parts of the story stayed in my memory, but I can't remember it happening. Again, there is a pause. You sit perfectly still and try not to breathe hard. You feel movement in the air, small ripples you know are speech. Then Miss Lawson takes your hand and says, "But are you sure, Helen? Are you sure that no one told you to say this?" "Yes, I am sure," you say, because you know you must keep teacher out of this. Though, of course, she did tell you to say this. She paced back and forth across your room, then sat beside you and told you this. The words were slightly different, but there are only so many words to say certain things. But you believe her. You always believe her, because it is through her that you know everything you know. Why wouldn't you believe her? Then on an impulse you say, "I did not copy that story on purpose. I know that would be wrong, and I would never do that," because it hurts you that they could think this of you, that he could think it of you, his special friend. It occurs to you that you have no way of knowing whether Miss Lawson is actually repeating your words. Her hands are so tentative, her spelling so slow. Who is this Lawson woman anyway? You take your hand and spell into the air, then stop. You spell into the air to teach her sometimes, but you are not sure it is universally understood. And anyway, you can't tell if they're looking at you. For all you know, they may have turned their backs. You had originally planned to speak aloud here today. You practice speaking aloud every day, and when you do it, people praise you. But you know that your speech is not universally understood. And anyway, today, you can't trust your lips and tongue and throat and lungs to make any of the sounds you've practiced. Miss Lawson's fingers are in your hand. But are you sure, Helen? Are you sure that Miss Sullivan didn't tell you to say this? I am sure, you say. You are determined to keep teacher out of it. No one told me to say this. She says, are you absolutely sure that when you wrote The Frost King, you thought it was your own invention, your own original idea? She says, did Miss Sullivan tell you that story and tell you to write it down? Did Miss Sullivan tell you to write that story? She says, do you remember, or are you just saying what Miss Sullivan told you to say? Asked and answered, I want to say. You're just badgering the witness now. I would be stalling for time, hoping to give you a couple of minutes to collect yourself. Because I don't know about you, Helen, but this is all getting a bit too fast and furious for me. I can barely keep typing. My hands are cold. I am actually shivering. You, I can't tell. You are so busy trying to convince them you're not lying and to keep teacher out of it that you actually seem not to have noticed that the questions have taken an ugly turn. The harder you try to shield teacher from blame, the more central she becomes. And then what happens to you, Helen? You become beside the point. And that scares me. Granted, I have the advantage of 100+ years of hindsight and a more cynical nature than yours. But even so, Helen, even so. So give me a minute and I'll get back to you. Thank you. This chair is mine?
Yes.
I have my water.
I'm John Levine from the College Writing Programs, and I have the pleasure of talking with Georgina Kleege about her writing. And we're just going to have a conversation here. You're welcome to eavesdrop. So first of all, I wanted to tell you that this morning, my 9-year-old daughter saw this book lying on the table, which I've had, and she asked me, she said, oh, that's Helen Keller. I know Helen Keller. She was blind and deaf, and she did some wonderful things. Is that what this book is about? And I said, well, actually, no. The person who wrote this doesn't really like Helen Keller. I simplified, oversimplified. And she didn't know what to say. She was shocked. Mm-hmm. So I have to ask you, I know that you had a long history with Helen Keller growing up. Did you have any misgivings about sitting down and taking on this project?
Oh, definitely. And there were many days during the writing where I thought this is the most ridiculous project I've ever undertaken. I wanted to throw the computer across the room. So on and so forth. It was initially very hard for me, and there were many kind of obstacles having to do with my own feelings of, resentment and annoyance and so on and so forth. But I persevered, and I think really what the place where I finally connected with Helen Keller was about writing. It was about her work as a writer. And I realized that I had never really thought of her as a writer before that. I sort of thought of her as this celebrity, this icon. But being an icon is not a job, it's not a profession, it's not a calling. But she was a writer, and that's how she perceived herself. That's how her life's work, as she understood it. And so then, I had to question myself and says, what does it mean that it took me all this time to sort of think about this person as a writer? And it gave me a way into her life story that I hadn't had before.
So when you sat down to write, you were writing about Helen Keller, writer, among other things.
Yeah. I was interested in this case, the plagiarism case, because although, she was exonerated and, she went back to being the sort of superstar student. It stayed in her memory, I think. When she writes about this incident, she's uncharacteristically reticent about it. She has only a couple of very brief paragraphs in an otherwise extremely well-documented life. And I think, as I understood it, it was because it was so traumatic. It made her doubt her own experience. It made her doubt her own thought processes. And it definitely made her doubt her writing, her ability to represent herself in writing. And so it was something that was always kind of in the back of her mind, that these doubts could always be raised about her. And to me, I thought, what a hardship for a writer to always have this feeling. Are people going to ask, how does she know that? How did she think that? Questioning the thought process.
Coincidentally, while I was reading your book this summer, I also was reading, it was a biography of Mark Twain, I think. And did you know that Mark Twain and Helen Keller were both Shakespeare doubters? You probably know that.
Yes.
Yeah, and they had, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, Twain was a big fan of Keller's, and they became friends late in his life in particular. But actually, he commented on this plagiarism case, because it was very well publicized. And he referred to the panel of inquisitors as, I can't remember the whole phrase, but a bunch of decayed turnips, which I thought was pretty accurate,
Moving on to one of your other titles, Sight Unseen, can you talk a little bit about this book, what inspired you to write this? You write in the introduction that you wanted to write about blindness rather than to write about your life. So can you maybe elaborate on that distinction?
The book is a collection of essays. I'll answer that sort of in two directions at once. It's a collection of essays about blindness, where my experience of blindness is only sort of one thing that I draw on. So I'm kind of interested in cultural representations of blindness, blindness in literature and film, blindness in language. Why do we have so many metaphors that equate blindness with obliviousness, prejudice, stupidity, etc.? And then ideas about blindness and reading, so on and so forth. So I wanted the focus really to be on the subject of blindness, and what I have to contribute is sort of autobiographical anecdotes. And one of the reasons I did it that way, actually, I could probably credit Helen Keller with this too, because there's something about a classic narrative, linear autobiography that always has this sort of overcoming trajectory. And it was something that Keller dealt with in her own writing. It was always sort of about, I overcame these obstacles and now I'm done. But what does that really mean in terms of disability? Is she no longer disabled? And so I thought that maybe a better approach would be to sort of come at the subject from different angles in each of the essays, and the cumulative effect would be to say something about a blindness, and I'm only one human being who's had this experience among many. and that it would be a sort of a picture of that subject rather than a picture of me.
Speaking of the numerous angles from which you approach blindness, I have to comment and applaud you on the titles of your essays, and just the title of this book, Blind Rage, Letters to Helen Keller, and then some of the titles in Sight Unseen, In Oedipus's Shadow, The Mind's Eye, Here's Looking at You, A Portrait of the Artist by His Blind Daughter. So here's my question. Do titles come to you instantly? Are you one of those people who gets the title and runs with it? Or do you agonize over it? Does it take you a long time to come up with these titles?
Both cases.
Okay.
You know, sometimes there are titles that just spring into my mind, or sometimes I do keep lists of titles, you know, sort of phrases, and I think, oh, it'd be nice to write something with that as a title. You know, and then the essay or the story comes from the title, and sometimes it's this constant, you know, what am I going to call this? Sight Unseen, I think I came up with that. I had a list of possible titles, but that sort of stuck pretty early. Blind Rage was a little trickier. I always had the Letters to Helen Keller part, but I had some people who were afraid that having rage in the title might turn people off. And it also, as it ends up, it doesn't really characterize the whole book, because I think the rage part kind of dissipates pretty early on. You know, it's very hard to maintain that level of anger for, you know, 200 pages. And then for a while, somebody suggested Blind Quest. Yeah, see, you know, obviously, Blind Rage is a much better title. I mean, I tried for a while, Blind Quest, and it just didn't work.
Well, it jumps
Yeah.
out at you. I mean, it's a title. If you saw both books on the shelf, I think people would pluck Blind Rage.
Yeah, well, that's what they want.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
That's what the publishers want you to do. It's like they really don't care what's between the covers, just that it has something that compels people to buy this book.
So was that a conversation with the publishers? Were they in on getting you to come up with a sexy title?
Well, actually, when I think when I went to press with Blind Rage, it was at that point being called Blind Quest. And then it was the marketing people who said that they liked Blind Rage better. And, you know, usually the marketing people are unhappy about everything. So, you know, and I was secretly pleased because I did like the Rage part. So.
In Sight Unseen, one of the essays, I cited the title, A Portrait of the Artist by His Blind Daughter. You write about, you are the child of two visual artists. And you write specifically about your father's ideas about craft and art in his own sculpture. So I'm wondering if that gets transferred to you when you think about your writing. Do you look at writing as craft, as art, as both? Is there a connection there?
Oh, there's definitely a connection there, and that's sort of central to that particular essay, because I'm writing about being the blind daughter of a visual artist and sort of recreating conversations that I had with my father, because he was very curious about the experience of blindness. But also what sort of vexed our conversations was that he was not a verbal person, really. You know, that words were not his medium. And words have always been my medium, you know. So it led to communication difficulties. But yeah, I think for me, if you're writing anything that you're expecting any other human being to read, you've got to be conscious of what it is you're doing. You have to craft that. It's not just emoting. It's not just, you know, sort of transcribing whatever gibberish comes out of your brain. That there's a process, you know, that words matter. Every word matters. And so you have to think about each word that goes onto the page. I sometimes tell students a phrase that's very resonant for me is the phrase "weigh your words." Weigh your words. How much do those words weigh? And which doesn't mean that the words always have to be weighty, but just that you have to be sort of conscious that you could have this word that, which one is better for the occasion. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a high degree of consciousness and conscious effort that goes into it. Though it's not as if I sit and I type one word and then I ponder it for, and weigh it. I mean, my process generally is that I write first drafts really, really fast. I type as fast as I can go, and I just get any kind of, whatever it is, down. Because I revise endlessly. And I can't revise until I have something there to deal with. But my first drafts are basically gibberish. I mean, they're basically incomprehensible to anybody but me. And even I have trouble sometimes. What was I thinking? But nobody's going to read that garbage.
Right.
It has to go through many refinements before anybody can read that.
Well, so in our art and craft duality, you're calling it garbage. It's certainly not the art, is it? Where do the art and craft break down? Can you break those down in your process?
Well, there is, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of ways of talking about what is art. I think we have a kind of romantic notion sometimes of, it's like the notion of the muse. The muse visits me and I go into this sort of trance-like state, and then later I snap out of it and, oh look, there's a story here. Oh, how nice, somebody wrote me a story, and they put my name on it, how thoughtful. So we have that sort of notion of art. I mean, I think of the two of them simultaneously, and the metaphor I was playing around with when I was writing about my father as a sculptor, in that essay I was trying to sort of simulate some of his process, because he was a sculptor, he was in the abstract expressionist period. He worked a lot with found scraps of metal, at least early on, and then he put them together in patterns and shapes. And so I was thinking about that as a process of a certain type of essay, sometimes called the mosaic essay, where you take fragments and you juxtapose them to form a coherent whole that doesn't have necessarily a linear narrative, but hangs together. What makes it hang together. And, so the craft is about how do you make it hang together. And sometimes in expository writing and an essay, it's about working the transitions. How do you get from point A to point B to point C? In narrative, there's sort of other techniques of how to get it to hang together. And I guess the art is when you can stand back from it and say, okay, that's it. That's the right solution. And it's a long, a time-consuming process. So.
Yeah. Back to weighing your words, or weighing one's words. That implies that you have an audience in mind, if not an actual audience. You're writing for an audience. So do you have a specific audience in mind when you're writing a specific piece? So for example, Blind Rage. Certainly you're writing to Helen Keller. I mean, we have that, that frame, but do you have an imagined audience as you're writing?
I have a lot of different audiences. I mean, the broad answer to that question is that, that book in particular I was writing to sort of that mythological creature, the general reader, you know, whoever that person might be. But that, in that case, it means somebody who doesn't know everything that I know about Helen Keller. You know, so it sort of dictates how you deliver the information, that you don't presume in advance that the reader will know, you know, have the sort of factual information at her fingertips. There are other things that I've written that's been to a more specialized audience. I mean, there's scholarly writing that, you know, is aimed at sort of other scholars, where there is a presumption that people know, you know, for instance, a text that you're writing about. But it's, you know, and a lot of times in the writing process, I mean, there are parts in every book I've ever written where when I read them over, I can remember at some point in the process thinking of a certain person and knowing that I was phrasing something in a particular way because of that particular person.
A person you know.
A person I know, yeah. You know, and sometimes it's, you know, maybe not a person I don't know personally, but like a critic, you know, somebody who said something, and, you know, you write, this is my answer to you. But then, and other times it's just, it's so sort of random, and it's funny to me how suddenly, you know, I'll be reading over something, and inevitably always that same person will crop up at the same moment, and I don't always know why that happens. But, you know, you always have to imagine a reader. It doesn't matter what you're writing. You always have to imagine that there's somebody out there who's going to read these words who isn't you. Years ago, a student said to me, I wrote comments the way everybody does, you know, and I said, oh, here you need to do this because your reader won't understand this, and your reader needs to know this. And he came to me and he said, now, who is this reader you're talking about? Isn't that you, you know? And I said, well, yeah, literally, at this point in your career, I am your reader. I am it. But, you know, I perceive myself as a stand-in for, you know, the rest of the world who might be reading this. And I'm sort of voicing the things that another reader besides me would want to know. So.
Right, okay. Back to your comment about you realized that you were writing for a critic. I mean, for that particular passage. So what's going on there? Is it a zinger that you're trying to give back to the critic, or what's going on inside?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's that. I mean, it's, you know, it's the frustration of a writer's life that you don't get to answer your critics. You know, I mean, sometimes you see in the letters pages of the New York Times book review or something, people will write back to their critics. And, you know, even when I agree with the writer, I sometimes think, oh, you shouldn't have, you know, you should have gotten someone else to do it.
Right.
You know, get your friend to do it. You know, somebody. I mean, generally speaking, you just don't have that opportunity. And I don't know, you know, it's not like this is a vengeance, you know. Because in some sense, the same critic, you know, isn't going to notice this thing that you're aiming at him or her. So it's just a kind of, it's what animates the writer's life, I think, is this, you know, all these kind of conversations that are going on in your head while you're there by yourself with the blank page or the blank computer screen. So, you know, for me, it's entirely private. You know, I could footnote places in text that were aimed at a particular person, but it would be of absolutely no interest or value to anybody but me. So.
When you're writing different types of pieces, a scholarly piece, a more general audience fiction, and I want to talk a little bit about your fiction as well, is your writing process the same? Do you approach it exactly the same way, say a scholarly piece versus a more imaginative piece like Darwin Thinks?
The process is very, very similar. It's very, very similar. I tend to work from fragments. You know, I tend to start with what I know at the moment or what I'm thinking at the moment. And then when that idea runs out, I just go on to something else. And always with knowing that later I can rearrange things or move things around or, you know, cut things out or stop things. So it doesn't really matter what type of piece I'm writing. What's different is maybe things like the diction, you know, sort of tonal qualities, and you know, the mechanical things. If I'm writing about a text, I'm going to be quoting text and so on and so forth. But somehow the process always feels the same to me.
So when you're writing a scholarly piece, do you just automatically click into that scholarly mode? And do you ever have to catch yourself and say, I'm not writing to Helen Keller here, I'm writing to the university?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes, because sometimes, you know, when you're writing, you can't think of a word or you can't think of how to phrase it, so you may go to a more colloquial place, because later you can come back and make that more formal, and then the reverse can happen also. Sometimes I say, I've got to loosen this up. This doesn't sound like the tone that I'm hoping for in this piece. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to I guess it goes back to the fact that my process is so dependent on revision, that it's a great source of security for me that when I can't think of how to put something, I said, well, tomorrow I'll figure it out. And in fact, I find I'm most productive when I'm working on several projects at once, because it means some days, you know, you wake up in the morning and you just feel the juices flowing and you can sit down and type and type and type and type and not worry about the revision part. And then other days you wake up and you just don't have that, but you're really in a mood where you can go in and go word by word by word.
So how many different projects are you working on right now?
Well, I'm working on a book project, but I'm working on different chapters, which are essentially separate essays in the project that are kind of separated. And some are close to completion, and some are, you know, further down the road. So from day to day, I can sort of choose what mood I'm in. Because that way it means that you don't sort of waste your time tearing your hair and saying, why do I do this to myself? You can just go in and say, okay, I'll work on this today, and tomorrow I'll work on that.
Well, so far from what you've said, it doesn't sound like you are one of those people who stares at the blank screen for 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks. You've got it wired so that if this isn't working, you can go over to this. You don't suffer writer's block, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I suffer doubt, you know. So all these techniques are what I've come up with to waylay the feelings of doubt, you know. But sure, when you stop to think about it, what am I doing? You know, what am I doing with my life, John? And because writing is hard, you know, it's hard. And then you're thinking, who's going to read this and who's going to care? And, you know, I really should have been a brain surgeon and all the doubts that one has. So I've come up with these techniques just to give me something to do so I don't have to think those thoughts.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to steal that because, yeah, I've got that doubting voice all the time. So you write for a number of different journals, among them the Southwest Review. You've had a number of pieces published by them. Do you have a Southwest Review audience in mind? So do you distinguish between different journals? Yale Review, is there or are you put out a piece and let the journal take care of the audience?
I mean, one of the things about the so-called small journals, the literary journals, is that, you know, I think of them in terms of the editors. and that they all have a certain flavor that is really has come about because of the particular editor and his or her sort of preferences and tastes. And the editors who've published me, I know that I know them and I have some sort of connection with them, and I know their journals and I know what other things that they publish and their sort of particular tastes. So I don't know that I write something for a particular journal. Sometimes when it's written, I say, oh, this looks more like, for so-and-so than for so-and-so. I would say that the Southwest Review, which is a review I admire a lot because I admire the editor, Willard Spiegelman, and I would say that he has a high tolerance for kind of my more experimental work. So like the Darwin Thinks essay, the original essay form of the Blind Rage book, which began as just a single essay. I sent it to him because I know that he's willing to take a chance on things, whereas some of the other journals where I publish, not so much.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I don't sort of set out to write for a particular editor.
And will, say, the Southwest Review, will they come to you about writing something, or do you write something and then look for someone to publish it? Would you go to your friend at the Southwest Review?
Sometimes because they know me, sometimes they'll ask me, we haven't heard from you in a while. What are you up to? Do you have anything? These operations, they're kind of, sometimes they got to get out an issue,
Right. Sure.
And they sort of look around for the writers that they know and look for things. And then, occasionally there are sort of special issues and they want, writers that they know to address a certain topic or something or whatever it is. But, I started like every other writer. I just, was submitting stuff cold over the transom. They didn't know me from Adam, and, eventually over the years, you kind of develop these relationships, mainly because you work at it, You say, thank you, that when somebody finally gives you an acceptance, then you go back to them and you keep keep praising them, and,
Right.
For their great taste and their great
Right,
skill
yes.
as editors.
Yeah.
And by the way, would you like to read this other thing I've written? So.
And
yeah.
once you're a known quantity and they know that they can count on you and they like your work, of course they want to invite you back.
Yeah.
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 So speaking of writing for a particular issue, if you know that there's a piece, they contact you, how much time would you typically have to write a piece? And this leads to my other question, how do you deal with deadlines?
Oh, God.
Sorry, this was supposed to be pleasant.
I know. Deadlines are not pleasant. Usually when I get invited to submit something, the better editors, probably give you like a year or something. Dealing with deadlines, I need a lot of time. I need a lot of time to write. And I know that about myself, so I never take on a project. If somebody says, oh, could you get us something in the next 3 weeks? Immediately I freeze up. So unless I have something that, is sort of on the verge of being done, I'll turn that down. Because I don't want to send out something just because my name will appear in print, But, deadlines is like for any work that has a deadline. You have a deadline, you know that this is coming, and so you sort of try to manage your time towards that. And you sort of know what it is that you need, how much time you need. I'm not a writer who can crank anything out, I can labor over emails. So, yeah.
So when you start a project, be it an article, an essay, a book, how much do you know about the finished product? Are you surprised by the finished product, or are you a writer who sits down and says, this is what it's going to be, and it's pretty much what it is at the end?
I'm often surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I think of myself primarily now as an essayist, and I'm using the word as Montaigne invented it. You know, it's an essay, it's a try, it's an attempt at something. And you know, in that there's a certain, it's provisional, it's experimental. So I don't always know how something's going to turn out. Sometimes I know where something begins. Sometimes I also know where it's going to end. The middle is this total morass. I don't know. Sometimes I don't know where it's going to end. I just sort of have to wait and figure out. Sometimes I'll have, fragments that it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and I keep rearranging and rearranging until finally I come up with what feels like the right pattern. And a lot of times, I make mistakes. A lot of times I think something should, I want something to be going in a certain way, and it doesn't end up going that way. I sort of wish, when I was a younger writer, I thought, someday I'll know what I'm doing. And that hasn't happened yet, so it's a little frustrating. I wish I could just sort of come up with a technique and just keep doing it, but I don't really seem able to do that. So, but it does sort of keep it interesting, because some days I'm sitting there writing and I say, oh, well, this is interesting. I wonder what I'm going to do with this. I wonder how I'm going to make this work. So
I'm guessing you don't do a lot of methodical outlining. You're not a person who's got things spelled out, or maybe you are. Share with us your system, whatever that is.
Sometimes I have sort of a loose framework, or I in a book length thing, I have a sort of set idea of chapters or sections. Sometimes a chapter may break up into 2 chapters. That's about all I can say, really. I mean, I feel better when it's open-ended, when I leave it open. I mean, it takes a lot of sort of faith, really, to do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But otherwise, if I have a sort of outline and this and this and this, inevitably, the minute I write that thing down, immediately there's some piece that doesn't fit. And then I'll bang my head against the wall for 3 days saying, well, I can't fit this into my outline. I have the outline. It won't fit into the outline.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, the problem is the outline. It's not the thing that won't fit. So then you throw out the outline and then, okay.
That's better.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So let's get a little bit more into your writing rituals. We've talked about outlining. When do you write? Is there a given time of day that you write?
I'm a morning writer. I work best in the morning.
Is that 5 in the morning, 9 in the morning?
Probably about 7 or 8 in the morning until I need to do something else. And I don't, I'm not a writer who say I have these hours that I must write for this many hours, because I just never have a schedule that allows me to do that. But I try to have, maybe at least, I can't even say it, at least an hour. I mean, sometimes there isn't even that. But sometime in the morning when I'm focused on my own work. And I recently, I'm a big fan of Flannery O'Connor. And I last fall I taught a seminar on Flannery O'Connor. And she has great quotes about writing. And she had this great sort of aphoristic style, so you can always find quotable quotes. And I can't quote this exactly, unfortunately, but she talks about how, because people are always asking her this question about, and she also wrote in the morning. She really blocked out, I think, 3 hours to work in the morning. And she said the thing about it, she says, it's not that I'm there writing all the, those 3 hours. Sometimes I'm just sitting, staring into space. And she said, but the thing about having a routine, why it's important for a writer to have a routine and to always be at the same place at the same time, is because if the muse wants to come find you, she'll know where you are, And I like that idea, it's like you can't just be you can't just go skittering off all by yourself. You got to be there.
It's like office hours.
It's like office hours. You have an office hours for the muse, and she'll know that you will always be there at that time. So,
I like that.
Yeah.
And when you're writing, are there certain things that you need? Coffee, tea, paper, pen, computer? Paint us a portrait of your
I write
space.
exclusively on the computer. Back in the mists of time, before there were computers, I wrote on the typewriter. And part of it's accessibility, since I don't read print. The computer, my computer has a synthesized voice screen reader, which reads to me everything I write. And that's about all I need. I usually start with a cup of coffee, which sometimes gets cold and nasty. But that's about it. So it's just me and a keyboard. And that's about it. I don't really have... when I'm focused, I can really be pretty well focused. I don't need a cork-lined room, and I don't need... if I'm really into something, I don't answer the phone, but I don't try to seal myself off from all distractions.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about that. Are there distractions that are just unavoidable? I mean, are there things that get in the way? I guess besides the inner voice, the doubt saying, I should have been a brain surgeon. Are there external things that...
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of other things you could be doing. The laundry, like what's in the refrigerator. Plus, there are more serious things having to do with teaching. You always are thinking about, what am I going to say today? What am I going to do? What am I, and it's a part of the discipline just to say, I'm not going to think about that now. Not going to think about that now. I can think about that later. And I'm not going to look at my email until 9 o'clock.
Wow. Wow.
I look at the email before I start working, and then when the juices run out. But yeah, and as I say, if the phone's ringing and I'm really working, I'm not going to answer the phone and those types of things. But if there's like a cat fight in the yard, I'll pay attention to that for a while.
Okay.
See who wins. If there's some car crash on the street, I'll go out with the other neighbors and say, "Ooh, what was that?" So.
When you're working on a project and you get an idea, perhaps for another project, will you stop and jot that down? Do you have a place that you keep ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I usually have some kind of file on the computer that says notes. I have 16 files that say notes. And so it's always this retrieval process of figuring out I know I wrote something about this. But yeah, because a lot of times when you're working on something and you're sort of waiting to figure out, some other idea will come to you and you need a place to put it down. But I have been known to just be typing away at something and suddenly another idea, and I'll just keep typing it there because then I can just cut and paste it somewhere else. But sometimes the stopping and figuring out, well, where should I put this? Where does this idea belong? It kills the thought. So sometimes it's just, you just keep typing. And then, the next day I'll read over and there's suddenly this odd random, what was, and then, then I have to figure out what to do with it, So
I'm just curious, was Darwin one of those ideas that came to you? A number of people in the audience have read the piece Darwin Thinks, which I think is remarkable. It imagines Darwin just before he's about to publish. Is that would you say that's a
Yeah.
fair characterization of his theory of evolution, putting it out there, and you, in a sense, as you do with Helen Keller, you insert yourself into the scene to wonder what was going on at that very moment. So, do you remember how that came to you?
Well, it is sort of related to the Helen Keller work, because I was kind of interested, when I was working on Helen Keller, I became interested in what it's like to write about a person whose life is so well documented. Because doing research on Helen Keller, you read all her autobiographical works, you can read volumes and volumes of letters, by her, and yet the point is, the point of the book is, well, where is she? Where is she in all that? Where's Helen Keller in all of that? And I can't remember exactly when it was, but there was a point where I decided I should just read all of Darwin. These thoughts come to me sometimes. I just thought I should just read all of Darwin. It just seemed like something I should do as an educated person. So I did that, and then and with him too, I became fascinated in this phenomenon of a person whose life was very well documented. These Victorians. I also wrote a piece about Lewis Carroll, same sort of thing.
Right.
But with Darwin, he kept a journal. He kept very precise records of his health day to day, the weather, all these experiments he was doing, who visited him, who wrote to him, who he wrote to, what he ate, conversations he had. It's all very well documented, and reading it, you begin to get this sense of a person, but yet, what eludes you? Where is the real Charles Darwin? And but the thing about that piece was that, again, there was a sort of identification with Darwin as a writer, because I think every writer has that doubt. That it seems like the book is ready to go out, but do I want to send it out? Do I want to do this? And I was struck in all my research on Darwin's life, not so much Darwin's writing, but Darwin's life. It's pretty clear that he came up with the theory long before he published, and that there was some hesitation about publishing. And in part, it was because he was smart enough to know the ramifications of this theory. And he was not really a person who liked confrontation. So there was a very kind of specific worry about how that work would be received. So I just wanted to sort of imagine Darwin, with the manuscript ready to go, what's holding him back, and then what eventually makes him go forward.
Yeah. As I said, it's a wonderful piece. I do want to allow some time to have the audience ask some questions, but one final question I want to ask you. You are a writer, you're also a teacher. How does your life as a writer inform your life as a teacher? I guess specifically, what are your expectations of your students as writers?
To do good work.
Okay.
One of the things that I always say in the creative writing classes on the first day, I always say this, that, I can't teach you how to write. Nobody can teach you how to write. There are people who claim they can teach you how to write, and you can, go to websites and pay money and get, 10 easy lessons on how to write fiction and how to write nonfiction. But writers have always learned to write the same way. You learn to write by reading a lot and writing a lot. That's how it's done. So I think what I can help students do is how to read your own work critically, which is not just to say, oh, it's so terrible, why did I do this? But to read it critically in a way that generates some progress. That is to say, to not only perceive where there might be problems, but try to imagine solutions. I feel like I can help students do that, and I can help students do that by having them read each other's work or read published writers and read carefully and attentively and read with imagination. And that down the road will benefit their writing. So those are my expectations.
Okay, all right, you heard it here. So I want to invite questions. If anyone has questions about anything we've talked about or anything else on your mind, and I will repeat the question. I have a lot more questions to ask, so no obligation. Oh, sorry, yes.
I have a question, came out of a conversation. It was mentioned that your father was an abstract expressionist. And I noticed today you use the words faith and doubt a lot. And I'm wondering if you as a child were aware, if it was a presence for you, the very powerful beliefs or practice of abstract expressionism, and whether that had an influence on you, whether something like that is, because frankly, I've never heard the child of a painter talk in this way. I'm wondering, is it analogous to religious faith, for example? There's something that powerful is in the household. Was it an influence on you, or was it something that, your own practice as an artist is something that was really invented by you?
I'm going to try to repeat that. It's a great question. So the question is, did growing up in a household, the child of abstract expressionists, did that figure into your philosophy, your practice as an artist?
Abstract expressionists with their beliefs, and when you mention faith, doubt, the risks you take, you don't want to shape it too much.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an analogy that I'm making sort of retrospectively, right? That I'm sort of, that I imbibed the philosophy of the abstract expressionist movement in a way. I mean, it's not as if my parents and their friends sort of sat around and talked the talk all the time. In fact, I mean, what I remember of my parents talking about art and other artists, it was all more in the realm of gossip, about who was sleeping with whom and who got drunk and got into a fist fight, those sorts of things. But I think there were ideas about, well, let me tell you this, because I wrote about this in Sight Unseen, and maybe this is helpful. When I was a child, I believed that abstract art was for adults, okay? And that representational art was for children. Because I encountered representational art in, school books and children's books. So that anything that looked, was meant to represent something in reality, I thought of as, kid stuff. And that true art was abstract. And of course, all the adults in my world thought this was great, because it sort of expressed a progress in art history where abstraction becomes the sort of ultimate goal, and there's sort of a narrative about that. So that's one thing. I would say that there, if you think of process painting, where an artist kind of sets a process and has this sort of belief that, eventually the work of art will be created. That feels somewhat analogous to what I'm doing in my process. But the end result isn't abstraction. I mean, the end result is meant to be more representational, more mimetic. I don't know if that's answering your question. Yeah. Is that helping? Okay.
Question, yes.
How do you feel about the switch from tactile books to e-books? Because writers, when they write, they can you can put pages and there's pictures and images as opposed to being computer's a flat screen. So do you think that the books are coming to an end? And how do you feel, and does it impact your writing process as you're writing on the flat screen as opposed to typing on a typewriter knowing that your book is going to be, because some of your books may have gone or have they gone to the e-book format.
Yeah.
People can't turn pages and pictures are flat as opposed to being, you know what I'm saying? The
Yeah.
textile nature of books.
So how do you feel about the transition from the traditional books to e-books?
Does it affect you as a writer?
And does it affect you as a writer?
It certainly affects me as a reader because, one of the benefits that people don't think about in terms of ebooks and books going to electronic formats, it's an incredible boon to blind people. I cannot tell you, in my lifetime, one of the primary handicaps of blindness, that is to say, inability to read print, we are that close to eliminating that because of these electronic technologies. What stands in the way is that, the formats aren't always compatible with the software I use. There are sort of delays. Some publishers are sort of slow to complying with these new standards. So, in a funny way, I greet the arrival of ebooks with great joy. I cannot tell you the pleasure I feel today, and it happens more and more frequently. Somebody says, "Oh, I read this book, you should read it." And I can go to my computer and, click, 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 download it into my little iPod type device, read it, and I feel like I'm in the conversation. Whereas even 10 years ago, there were 100 other steps. Either I had to wait for it to be produced in an audio format, or else I had to scan the book, get the book scanned by somebody, this sort of cumbersome process, weeks and weeks and weeks. So I know what you mean. The funny thing is I own a lot of books. I can't read them. They're there. I know a lot of writers, they give me their books. It's like, thank you, I like books. We're in a, look where we are, So, and and people always say, oh, I could never curl up with a Kindle. I could never, I don't know the future. I don't know, will books be a thing of the past? And, there is sort of a difference about reading a book where you turn the page. It sort of marks the time of reading in a way that when you're reading, as I'm reading, it's essentially like an endless scroll, And even though you can mark that ebook with pages and sort of the same formatting things, it feels essentially different. Yeah.
And on that note, I want to thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Thank you.